Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Fasken, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Karen Sargeant, and I have the privilege of serving as the managing partner of Fasken's Ontario region, which includes our Toronto and Ottawa offices. I am sitting in our Toronto office as we speak, and many on the line are joining us from across Canada. So before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that those of us in Canada are joining from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of Indigenous peoples. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people have been present in Canada for thousands of years. These Indigenous peoples have a profound and ongoing attachment to this territory. At Fasken, we recognize that we have a role to play in the ongoing process of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities here and elsewhere in Canada. We have embarked on the reconciliation journey by adopting a plan with the overall purpose of contributing meaningfully to reconciliation. Before we begin our discussion, please see the information on your screen for some housekeeping items, one of which deals with questions. If you have questions of the panelists, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A function. At the end of the event, QR codes and links will be available for those of you looking to obtain your Ontario, Quebec, or BC CPD certificates. And we'd also appreciate if you could take a moment to fill out our survey at the end of the event as well. And so now to the main event. We're honored to have with us 500 participants joining us from around the world. Your presence reflects the global importance of the topic we're about to explore, which is a landmark agreement that is poised to reshape the critical mineral supply chains and accelerate Ukraine's post-war recovery. To help us unpack the implications of this agreement, from geopolitical strategy to legal frameworks and investment opportunities, we've assembled a truly exceptional panel. Moderating today's discussion is my colleague, James Villeneuve. James is a senior strategic business advisor here at Fasken, and he brings deep experience in international diplomacy and trade, having served as Canada's Consul General in Los Angeles, where he represented Canadian interests across Southern California, Arizona, and Nevada. James joins us today from Nashville. Joining James are our three distinguished panelists. First, I'll introduce John Price. John is the Managing Director of America's Market Intelligence, and he will address Ukraine's post-conflict mining potential and the conditions needed to attract global investment. John joins us today from Mexico City. Dan Bilak, a former Fasken lawyer, is Senior Counsel at Kinstellar and former Chief Investment Advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine. He will offer a Ukrainian perspective on the deal, its implementation timeline, and the security landscape for investors. Dan joins us from Kyiv, where he's experienced a truly harrowing last couple of days. Jamie Head joins us from Hunton Andrews Kurth, a law firm where he is a partner. He will explain how the agreement not only grants the U.S. access to Ukraine's national resources, but also to public-private infrastructure projects, and he joins us from Washington, D.C. Together, this truly international panel will explore the strategic, economic, and legal dimensions of this unprecedented partnership and what it means for investors, policymakers, and the future of Ukraine. Thanks again for joining us. We look forward to a dynamic and insightful conversation. And James, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. I'd also like to thank Michael Barassa, who helped pull this together, one of our senior partners. We originally discussed the idea of this, and I thought it was great, and he pulled together really a great panel. We've been connecting with each other on a fairly regular basis. And today we're going to focus on the landmark development in international cooperation and resource strategy. The United States and the Ukraine have entered into a groundbreaking agreement that grants U.S. special access to Ukraine's critical mineral projects, including lithium, titanium, and rare earth elements. These resources are essential to the defense, aerospace, and green energy sectors, and this deal is poised to reshape global supply chains and strategic alliances. In addition to this mineral partnership, the two countries have launched a joint reconstructive investment fund, which is obviously going to be needed. The initiative is designed to support Ukraine's rebuilding efforts with a funding source from revenues generated by mineral, oil, and gas projects. The fund is co-managed by Ukraine's Public-Private Partnership Agency and the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, reflecting a long-term commitment to economic recovery and resilience. This is more than a resource agreement. It's a strategic alliance with wide-reaching implications for geopolitical investments and the future of sustainable development. We brought together our panel of leading experts to explore legal, economic, and strategic dimensions of this transformative deal. So thank you for being here. Let's get into the conversation. And maybe we'll start with Jamie. Jamie, can you just start and explain what the DFC is? And we'll get into that a little more, but can you start?
Happy to, and I'm really grateful to be here with this panel. So DFC, right, United States International Development Finance Corporation, is essentially America's development finance institution. It's DFI. And I think to give some context to what DFC is, and that'll help us understand the role that the United States may play in this partnership going forward and the way that its role is laid out in the framework agreement. I think it may be helpful to just situate DFC briefly inside the sort of history of U.S. development finance. If the U.S. has been, I think, a leading international development financier since at least the end of World War II and the Marshall Plan, if you think about its role in the founding of the World Bank and the other multilateral development finance institutions that came out of the Bretton Woods conference. Aside from that sort of multilateral participation in development finance, the United States has also played a sort of a bilateral role, a role on its own with its own sort of national institutions. That in some ways starts in the 60s with President Kennedy and USAID, which of course everybody has been watching what's happened to that in the United States. It starts in the 60s with that, with AID playing this role of sort of administering foreign aid and development assistance. And then in 1969, Richard Nixon shifted some of those responsibilities that had been in AID into this new organization called the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. That's OPIC. So a lot of people, when they hear DFC, one thing that people say is, oh, that used to be OPIC. And that gives some people some context for what it is. OPIC's idea was to bring like more business-like management to international development from the US. All right, that existed between the 70s to the 2000s. It got reauthorized every year, OPIC did. I would say during that period, it experienced a lot of criticism and concern that the US development financing in general was rather disjointed and all over the place, okay? And then I would say in the 2000s in particular, with the Chinese investing in an unprecedented levels in sort of cross-border investments into emerging markets as a tool of foreign policy. So this is the Belt and Road Initiative, right? In response to that, I think there was this growing understanding in the United States that development finance needed to be retooled. That culminated in this agency that we're talking about, DFC. Okay, there was something called the BUILD Act in the first Trump administration. So this is 2018, which authorized the creation of DFC, which would be a full-service development finance institution to basically, and among other things, to help the United States compete with Belt and Road and the Chinese Communist Party abroad. Okay. Importantly, it incorporated a lot of the authorities that OPIC had and additional authorities that USAID had to provide direct loans, to give loan guarantees, to provide political risk insurance, but it added new tools like direct equity investments and a much higher cap on investment, $60 billion. I'll just close by giving you the context for DFC. So AID has been removed by the DOGE program, right? So AID, they literally took the name off the building, okay? DFC, in some ways, appears to be the most likely vehicle and the preferred vehicle for investments by the United States abroad going forward. It is being currently considered before Congress for reauthorization, which it has to do by October. The bills that are currently being considered on the Hill do a number of important things which are interesting from the perspective of this conversation, namely that they talk about perhaps doubling the size of DFC's permitted financial exposure to something like $120 billion. There's even discussion of even more exposure than that. So the reason you've asked this question, what is DFC, is because that is the agency that has been provided to be the limited partner in the framework agreement that we're going to wrestle with today. That will be essentially the arm of the United States that is representing the United States in this framework agreement.
And just on that, is there any opposition to this, to reauthorizing or expanding it, or does it seem to have a lot of momentum?
I think it's important to understand that the BUILD Act itself, so this is in the first Trump administration that created DFC, had something like 97 of our 101 senators voted for it. So overwhelming bipartisan support for enlarging the toolkit of the United States as a development financier. The political context is different now, especially after the changes with USAID. The Trump administration has made clear that future development finance from the United States is supposed to directly advance U.S. national security. It's supposed to make America safer and more prosperous in a way that's much more tightly tied, I would say, to U.S. national interests than perhaps the way that the World Bank Charter works or the other development finance institutions that the United States is, after all, a shareholder in. So is there opposition? I think there's a clear path for reauthorization in the United States. There may be, there are proposals that are being discussed openly about even a larger role for DFC as something like a sovereign wealth fund with an even larger exposure. I think there will be room for, there'll be disagreement within the spectrum in the calls of Congress. In some ways, we're all waiting for the new appointees who are all thoughtful, serious people appointed by President Trump, not yet Senate confirmed, to assume their roles and then to start advocating for the reauthorization. I think it's clear to me that there will be a reauthorization. How expanded the roles of DFC will be is an open question.
Okay. And one final thing, how do you see this, or what role would it be intended to play in mineral offtake in the Ukraine in particular?
Yeah. So, and Dan's going to talk about this too, but the framework agreement that was signed at the end of April of this year, right? It creates this United States Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund that you mentioned in your introductory remarks, right? DFC is going to be one of the limited partners in that structure, along with Ukraine's state organization agency on support of public-private partnership. Daniel's going to talk about these more, but briefly, these agreements have been ratified by the parliament in Ukraine with an overwhelming majority. They've also been backed up with additional agreements that give more clarity, although they are not public, on the operations and government governance of this fund. Essentially, DFC has a really important role under this. It gives sort of preferential rights to participate in natural resources and public-private partnerships to this new partnership fund, and then it gives DFC in particular preferential rights to offtake, to the right to purchase minerals that are mined and or processed in Ukraine. And I say a preferential process. We can talk about exactly what that means. They have something like a right of first refusal for DFC or its assignee or designee. So given the importance of the new partnership to all investments in minerals, they have this preferential right to participate in investments in mining and in all concessions, all public-private partnerships in Ukraine. That's the preferential rights of the partnership, of which DFC and Ukraine's agency for P3s are the limited partners, are the partners. And then also DFC has this other right to actually have this right of offtake, of almost something like a right of first refusal for all minerals coming out of Ukraine. So potentially very large role for this agency, DFC.
Wow. Well, thank you. We'll come back to you in a second, but maybe over to John quickly. John, we're now talking about the mechanics, but how would a post-conflict Ukraine mining investment environment compare with other jurisdictions? I know you've done work in other parts of the world. Can you just give us a bit of reference on that?
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that the agreement that's been put into place between Ukraine and the U.S., first of all, I think the most important thing is it's highlighted to the world just how rich in critical minerals Ukraine is, something that I think was not well known, even in some mining circles. And I also think that it has awoken interest by Europeans who also are concerned about securing their supply chain for energy transition and for their own defense industry, which is now growing, the fastest growing defense industry in the world. And so the agreement, although some might argue that it's, untenable or it might not be followed through on, I think its most valuable function at this point is really highlighting the potential of Ukraine's mining industry. But assuming that Ukraine can secure its borders post-conflict, there's still a number of things that mining companies are going to want to see and feel more comfortable with, because at the end of the day, the mining companies that the U.S. and Europeans and other countries want to attract to Ukraine are private sector players, and so they have options. And the U.S. mining industry is not the biggest in the world and has all kinds of incentives to focus its efforts on U.S. soil right now. So it remains to be seen whether U.S. mining companies will take up this opportunity or whether others will take it up. But they're going to want to see, at this point in time, we know what we know about what's underground in the Ukraine, but it's based upon very good geomapping, but geomapping that was done several years ago. So there's actually an upside potential for finding even more resources as these resources are mapped again. In terms of governance and framework, I think Daniel can go much more in the weeds, but there's certainly some concern that the rules of play for miners in Ukraine today are maybe not at the level of transparency and clarity that they would like vis-a-vis a jurisdiction like Canada or Australia. But I'm pretty sure that the Ukraine will join the EU, and along with that becomes a harmonization of a lot of regulations. Probably a biggest concern would be, even if we are at peace in Ukraine, we know, and Daniel knows better than anyone, just how much infrastructure is being destroyed. Now, at the end of the day, taking ore out of the ground and shipping that ore doesn't require that much infrastructure. It requires a functioning port, which Ukraine has, or the Danube River basin. It also has roads, some of them damaged. But Ukraine's real potential is not just as a miner, but as a processor of these minerals into metals. And for that, it will need to rebuild its impressive and expand again its impressive energy output. And obviously, the priority is making sure that its own citizens and basic infrastructure has enough energy capacity, but eventually the mining industry will need that as well. The security situation, how will it look? Obviously we would need to see full access across the country, and that no pockets of Ukraine are ungovernable. That would be definitely a red flag for any mining investor. And then the other is around sort of social concerns. there's going to be resettlement. And I'm not sure, again, Daniel knows a lot more about what's going on the ground, but I'm not sure to what degree those resettlement efforts might complicate land titles and access to mines that mining companies would want clarity on before moving forward. So there is incredible strategic value, particularly to the Europeans, I would say far more than to the Americans, in terms of securing supply of critical minerals that will support European defense industry, which is on the rise, and their energy transition, which is, along with China, the most advanced in the world. And all of and that issue alone, that strategic value, might be enough to counterweigh all these other issues that get in the way. But there's no question there's going to be some work to be done beyond just securing the peace.
Great. And which minerals would the Ukraine have a competitive advantage? Why would people want to be there? What's there?
Well, the most exciting in terms of competitive advantage for Ukraine is titanium. So before the 2022 invasion, Ukraine was by far the largest titanium producer in Europe. And in fact, outside of China and Russia, I believe is the third biggest producer. Maybe Mozambique is a bigger producer. But given the fact that we are in a bipolar, possibly tripolar world where particularly the defense industry, the Western defense industry, wants to make sure that it has its own resources and is not relying on Russia or China, Ukraine's titanium deposits become very, very important. Lithium, Ukraine has plenty of hard rock lithium. In fact, I think they have more than we realize. And certainly the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act is going to provide some incentives to go after that lithium. But lithium is also found in large supplies in places like Australia, the biggest producer, Chile, the second biggest producer. Argentina is an up-and-coming producer. So there's lots of competition on lithium. In graphite, Ukraine has commercial scale graphite reserves, and graphite is important because China dominates. It supplies over 70% of the world's natural graphite and almost all of its synthetic graphite. So if we are going to delink from Chinese supply of critical minerals, then Ukraine graphite becomes very important. Rare earths is another one. They are less developed in terms of understanding the true resource capacity of rare earth elements. But again, given the dominance of China, there's going to be a lot of interest in exploring and expanding the measurement of those reserves of rare elements. And then uranium, of course, Ukraine is a big uranium producer. If you look around the world, who else produces uranium? It's Russia and Kazakhstan, both potentially out of bounds, and then Canada and Australia. So for the French uranium or nuclear power industry, and for the Ukrainian nuclear power industry, which will be absolutely instrumental at turning Ukraine into not just a mining economy, but a mining process and metal producer economy, cheap energy will be important. And so uranium is key to them as well.
Wow. Good overview. Thank you. We'll come back to you on some of those other points. Let's go over to the Ukraine, to Dan. First of all, Dan, before we got on this call, Dan was giving us a bit of a description of just the situation on the ground in Kyiv. Dan, you want to just maybe give us what the last few days look like, and then we'll get into some specifics on mining?
Thanks, James, and thanks for having me, folks. Always a pleasure to be at my first firm I was ever with, Fasken. I have to say we probably had the biggest fallout and attack from the skies 2 nights ago than we've had since the beginning of the war. It was almost 478 combination of drones and ballistic missiles, 430, about 430, almost 440 drones, and the rest were ballistic and hypersonic missiles. And I was saying that, you sort of get used to air raids and drones and missiles over the course of 4 years flying over your house. But a hypersonic missile is a very different animal. It screams, it screeches, and as it was flying, the trajectory was coming down over where I live, going into the city, and it was really like a banshee. And then our anti-missile system, our Patriots, took it out, and the explosion was. I thought my house was going to collapse. And it's made of brick and concrete. So I mean, this isn't one of your Canadian spruce 2-month jobbies. So yeah, almost 40 people killed and over 120 injured. So it was pretty bad. But this is what we live with every single day, and whether it's in Kyiv or somewhere else across the country. And unfortunately, we feel very strongly that this has now become so normalized in the Western press and in the Western consciousness that it doesn't even rate a mention in the newspapers. Clearly, the story of the day right now is Israel and Iran, which is also very important to us because 20,000 anti-missile shells that were slated for Ukraine were diverted by the administration, the White House, to Israel to protect them. And all of this signals to Putin that it's safari time. That's basically he's on safari in the country. I mean, it's a terrorist state. It's just sowing terror everywhere. He's not bombing. He is bombing some critical industries, and I'll get to that in a minute. But much of what he's bombing is civilian infrastructure and apartment buildings and schools and playgrounds, and this is a war again. This is a war of extermination against the Ukrainian people, and I think that everybody's got we need to talk about recovery. We need to talk about this critical minerals deal because it's directly relevant to this consideration. But we need to remember we got to win a war, and it's not just Ukraine's war. This is we are fighting this war as European nations are now 4 years later starting to realize we are fighting this war against on behalf of the democratic countries of Europe and beyond. And it's we do the fighting, we do the dying, but we really need the help. And frankly, I was going to talk about this later, but I can talk about it now. Everybody asks me what's the security guarantee that we're going to get if we invest. Well, clearly there has to be a permanent cessation of hostilities that is meaningful and sustainable. And right now, any based on how Putin views the war, any peace plan for Ukraine means Ukraine gets left in pieces, and you will not have any security and stability in Europe at the present time. In fact, and I believe this absolutely fervently. I serve in the military, in the Ukrainian military, in the reserves. And I know from my fellow soldiers and people I know even up to the general staff in the Ministry of Defense, there isn't anybody that doesn't think that that believes that there's going to be any peace in Ukraine until the Russian army is defeated here. And the fact of the matter is that this war is winnable. I mean, we have proven time and again by fighting asymmetrically. I mean, we proved last month, late last month, that $70,000 worth of drones can take out $7 billion worth of strategic aircraft. And critical minerals has an absolutely vital role to play because the nature of warfare has changed. Because a country like Ukraine, which is 10 times smaller than, or 5 times smaller than Russia, the Russians talk about the inevitability of their victory. Well, if it was so goddamn inevitable, why are they still fighting it and fighting for it? And the nature of warfare has changed. Combat tactical maneuvering of large armored vehicles is now a thing of the past. A $500 drone can take out a $1 million tank. The economics make it just completely untenable. And the drone is a lot more maneuverable than the tank is. The advent of collaborative combat intelligence on the field, where you have multiple autonomous and unmanned vehicles, both in the air and on the ground, essentially talking to each other and seeking out through whether it's an ISR drone, a surveillance drone, or it's a kamikaze drone. They're talking to each other, seeking out targets and attacking them. This is stuff I used to read about in comic books when I was a kid. I mean, it was never going to happen, but it is the reality today. And how do you navigate in a GPS denied environment? The minerals that John alluded to this, that a country like China controls, 90% of which is necessary for those things to work. And guess what? They ain't on our side. Yeah. And the United States, even though this was all in all a pretty good agreement for Ukraine, the earlier versions were something like the British would have given to their colonies in the 1700s to sign. We got away. The U.S. backed down from demanding $500 billion share of Ukraine's rare earths and other minerals in exchange for aid that it had already provided, and that clause that they had, that we had to contribute further minerals for any exchange of future U.S. aid, all came out. But it was a good deal for America. It was a good deal for Trump, I think, because he got a deal that he could sell to his electorate, and it offset his to some degree the dependence that the United States has on China and for its minerals. And the latest trade tensions between Washington and Beijing make it even more important for the United States to look to its friends and allies for assistance as opposed to its adversaries and its enemies. And Washington, as John I'll finish on this, that Washington did its homework. Ukraine has deposits of 22 of the 50 most critical minerals that the U.S. has on its list. It has 5% of the world's natural resources. And even though they're still Soviet era, but they were very good, Soviet era mapping, as John points out, the Ukraine's critical minerals are valued at about $12 trillion. So they knew what they were doing.
And how is it perceived in the Ukraine? I mean, for people in North America.
Ukraine, James, it's Ukraine, not the Ukraine.
Apologies. The perceptions of it there. I mean, this got a lot of media coverage in the United States and in Canada. How does the average person relate to this or think this is important? Or
yeah, I mean, we see we see everything pretty much through the prism of national security these days, and everybody understands the vital importance that America plays in our defense and in our prosecution of our defense and fighting off the Russians. So, but it's also a double-edged, two sides of the same coin. There's the national security side, and it's also part of the overall reconstruction efforts that we're embarking on in the country as well. And the fund that Jamie was talking about, the American Ukrainian Investment Fund for Reconstruction. It was signed in warp speed. It was signed or implemented. It was signed in April 30th. It was ratified by Ukraine's parliament May 8th, and it was launched on May 23rd. I mean, that's a record by anybody's standards, I think, for a legislative process. We maintained, I think people were happy that we weren't forced to hand over the sovereignty of our natural resources. And we were able to achieve some of our strategic objectives, which is first and foremost, keeping the U.S. in Ukraine, integrating Ukraine into the global supply chain for critical minerals, which is all the more we integrate into the world, the more we disintegrate from Russia, if you like. And as John alluded to, it actually facilitated, people talk about the green energy renewal, but really, without nuclear, I'm sorry for all the green energy folks, but no way the world is going to reach its net zero without nuclear energy. And for Ukraine, nuclear energy before the war represented 55% of our power. Now that we have zero thermal power plants left, they've all been bombed into oblivion, and half of our hydropower plants are gone. We rely on a small degree of renewable energy, but wind and solar is only going to get you so far. Nuclear is the big part, and that's why the Russians are targeting the substations, because they want to knock out the power going in to keep the nuclear power plants afloat. And they also understand that Ukraine has the potential, because we're getting rid of all this Soviet era inefficient energy. We are going to rebuild, as John pointed out, our entire energy infrastructure. And Ukraine is going to become the laboratory for experimenting with all the things that Europe and the United States talk about, but are afraid to implement because somebody's vested interest is going to get hurt. But Russia understands that we actually have the potential to become energy dominant in Europe, and we need that power to provide for the smelting, for the upstream added value processing that was referred to earlier, as well as EV and crypto and all of that stuff. So this, I think in Ukraine, we view this as very much a big part of national security, because it keeps the Americans in the game, and it gives them a stake in our security and keeping us safe. It also helps advance our European inclusion and the integration into the European security and economic architecture. And as John points out, the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, which was signed in 2016, it was designed to facilitate that process. We've now probably are able to close half of the acquis communautaire that's required to become a member of the EU. And at the same time, because of the regulatory compliance and convergence that's taken place over the last 8 years, companies coming into Ukraine to do business, so it's like doing business in any other EU country. Levels of corruption are probably EU levels of corruption by now. So, we should get in just on that alone.
Right.
James, maybe just to pick up on the Dan's point about the extent to which this involves the United States in Ukraine's reconstruction, it gives the United States interests in Ukraine that are more concrete, or easier to point to than they were before. Just to put a little bit of meat on the bones of what Daniel has said, and to me, I think that just the details on how the capital contributions to this reconstruction fund work sort of hit on a lot of what Dan said. So the idea is that half of the amounts received by the Ukrainian government authorities for licenses, permits, production sharing agreements, so half of Ukraine's take from mineral exploitation in Ukraine would be contributed to this partnership going forward for all of the natural resources relevant as assets. The framework agreement, there's some people with more mining experience than me on this call, but I can't come up with too many minerals that aren't in this definition of the relevant minerals, right? It's pretty much what you can get out of the ground that's commercially useful. Half of the government's take going forward, again, licenses, production sharing contracts, half of that will be contributed to this fund. So that's where some of the capitalization comes from. The other part of the capitalization, and this goes to Dan's point about the U.S. now being slightly more anchored or tied to the ongoing efforts of Ukraine to defend itself. The idea is that the U.S. capital contribution, the nominal amount that they will have said to have contributed to this partnership, will be increased by the assessed value of any new military assistance of the U.S. going forward. In some ways, to Dan's point about the political palatability in the United States of this, it directly says that future military donations, largesse of the United States to Ukraine will be, on paper at least, in this partnership, noted to the benefit of the United States. So this will be part of their contribution. And it essentially provides an incentive, I suppose, is the right way to say it, for future military assistance from the United States. It doesn't say in that framework agreement what the initial capitalization will be. And I know that there are actually in the news, there's reported first deals coming out that this fund will participate in. But I think that it's instructive, the compromise that was struck on how the funding for this reconstruction fund would be, where the money would come from, gives an idea that it really does tie the United States, as Dan says. Interestingly, so now you're going to have this fund, right? There's also an interesting way. How is this fund going to participate in the reconstruction, right? There are a couple ways. I just want to talk for the mining, the detail part of it, where the source of this fund's unique position in Ukraine comes from. As part of the framework agreement, all Ukrainian government authorities that are responsible for licenses and permits related to all of these critical mineral assets, and all of the Ukrainian governmental authorities that are responsible for public-private partnerships. So look, toll roads, airport concessions, port concessions, any kind of future public-private partnership where there is a private sector person running an infrastructure asset. So all of the Ukrainian government authorities responsible for those natural resources and for the public-private partnerships have to include in the licenses that they give to the private parties, in the agreements, in the permits, a couple of important obligations. One, every private sector entity participating in those spaces in their license is going to have to give what's called relevant investment information to this partnership, to this new reconstruction fund that's been created. They have to provide this reconstruction fund with investment information about what they're doing. And so this is everybody mining and everybody running a concession in Ukraine. Now, so they have to give them information. And then, and their licenses will say this, and then if the partnership, if that reconstruction fund expresses a formal interest in what is called participating, not totally clear what that means, but participating in one of these natural resources or these public-private partnership projects, that the license is going to require the private party to give something like a right of first refusal to the reconstruction fund to participate in the financing of this project. Pretty significant place that this reconstruction fund could have in the future reconstruction of Ukraine because of those rights inside of these licenses.
Very interesting.
That's literally America first.
Sounds like it.
Well, it's an interesting one because if, as a limited partner, right, that is contributing the cash for the transaction, of course, the partnership, the reconstruction partnership, is half owned by Ukraine, right? And so dividends out, you would expect, it doesn't spell out all of this in the framework agreement that was ratified, but presumably half of the dividends that come out would go to Ukraine, perhaps as adjusted for military assistance funding from the United States. So I'll leave it to you whether America first is right. It may be America and Ukraine partnership, I think, is the way.
We don't have a problem with that. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, but I think it is an interesting compromise in partnership, which is designed essentially, though, to give the United States, in fact, a very large incentive in a successful Ukrainian reconstruction. There is a potential incentive here for the United States to really want the war to come to an end and reconstruction to begin.
And Jamie, a quick question. If I'm an engineering firm that wants to be a part of that reconstruction, or a miner or a smelter, do I have to be an American company to take advantage of this program?
No, that's an interesting question, John. And no, almost certainly not. Now, I say that without knowing without the program being fully developed. The reason I'm said that more confidently is that the Build Act, when it made DFC and we moved away from OPIC, explicitly overturned the former rule that OPIC had been subject to, which was that there had to be an American company involved, an American nexus, American off-taker. There was a whole rubric, legal analysis of whether or not the United States was sufficiently involved in the project in order to justify OPIC. DFC is not subject to that. So again, as a counter to the Belt and Road Initiative, as a new tool of American foreign policy, it explicitly, and if you look at who a DFC lends to, they do not have a U.S. nexus. I would expect Canadian and Australian mining companies to be at the forefront of the beneficiaries of if this program were to get off the ground, just because that's where the mining companies are. And there is no certainly statutory reason that DFC couldn't do that. And what I would expect is, given the need to find companies that are ready and able to begin the process, that it would not be an American company. Now, maybe companies with tight alignment with U.S. interests otherwise, right, or a U.S. presence. There's a major domestic mining initiative in the United States, including involving DFC, that there could be the companies that I'm talking about that maybe are headquartered in Australia or Canada could in fact become more American in some ways. They could be listing on our stock exchanges and participating in American markets in a way that they haven't as much in the past decades. But I don't think that this should be read as an American-only investment. In fact, it's explicitly not that way. This is meant for all reconstruction that takes place in Ukraine, which I would expect to have a huge European component to it, I would expect.
And the first right of refusal, because the Europeans, I think, it is kind of part and parcel to the Americans got there first militarily. The Europeans are now coming up in the rear in terms of support. I think the same will happen with interest in critical minerals. The Americans have expressed interest. They've formed this deal. That has only whetted the appetite of the Europeans that much more. They realized, and I would argue that Western Europe needs Ukraine more than the U.S. needs Ukraine in terms of a supplier of critical minerals. So the way the agreement is worded, is there the possibility for Ukraine to open up a parallel agreement with the Europeans to also help fund, rebuild of the country?
I don't think so. I think this reconstruction fund has really exclusive and a unique role in reconstruction, but it would not, there's nothing that would suggest to me that a new limited partner, I mean, the fact that they spoke of the partnership being formed by these limited partners, the general partner is not specified, would suggest to me that the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development would be a natural additional partner. There's nothing to suggest that that's true, but you would think the reconstruction fund that has been set up, part of the reason, this is conjecture on my part, but part of the reason that it's being structured as this fund is perhaps to enable additional capital investments.
That's absolutely right. And by the way, the agreement respects Ukraine's commitments to the EU in respect of, for example, production sharing tenders. That's an obligation Ukraine has under the EU-Ukraine facility. And so, but coming back, I wasn't actually being facetious when I said it was America first, because it's brilliant in the sense that it's saleable to even MAGA land as something. We're not giving aid to anybody. That if we're going to be providing aid to Ukraine, we're sort of paying it forward, and so be it. And I think that's fine from a Ukrainian standpoint. Somebody asked a friend of mine, government official, are you worried about this encroachment on Ukraine's sovereignty? And he responded saying, I'd much rather have American oligarchs developing Ukraine's minerals resources than Ukrainian oligarchs. And I have a lot of sympathy with that point of view, because I was 3 years, I was advisor to the Prime Minister on foreign investments and ran UkraineInvest, which was the Ukrainian government's investment promotion agency from 2016 to 2019. And I saw what was going on. I won't mention who was behind it, but I saw what was going on in terms of the grant of lithium licenses, and I was fighting this tooth and nail behind the scenes to prevent these licenses from going into government people's hands who are friendly to the government, just to sit on them and then just wait for the day when an American shows up and you can get your payday, and so. Corporate governance behind this, I think, is going to be critical to actually bringing transparency to what has historically been a very opaque sector. And that will be to Ukraine's benefit. It'll be to the American companies and to the European companies benefit very, very significantly. I mean, the Minister of Economy, Vice Prime Minister and Minister of Economy just announced a first pilot project, could be a pilot project under this agreement. So they're not waiting for the war to end. There are a lot of things that are actually moving forward. And they made an announcement to develop lithium deposits in Kirovohrad Oblast. And I know exactly which deposit that is, because that was the one I was trying to pry loose the mining license from the clutches of these oligarchs, and the government did take that back. And as John pointed out, we have 1/3 of all of the proven lithium reserves in Europe, almost 500,000 tons. And this would be a very, very good example. Titanium is already operational. These aren't stuff just sitting in the ground. We have had a titanium mining industry for many, many years, still from Soviet times. In fact, I was doing the privatization of a titanium mine before the war broke out, and they were the parties that were interested were coming in because they wanted American off-takers. They could see that Russia and China were going to be strategic adversaries and enemies, and that this was going to provide the United States with a lot of vulnerability. And Ukraine, as a loyal ally, as a reliable ally, could become a key producer. And we can meet the U.S. and EU titanium metal requirements for the next 25 years. We've got something like 5 or 10% of the world's titanium, and coming to John's point on graphite, we have 6. With China has a lock on, but we still have 6% of the global graphite deposits. So there are very good reasons why this thing is actually, the government of Ukraine is moving forward now to at least get that process started, to build some momentum with the U.S.
And I'll just say the choice of DFC to me is significant to this question of transparency and corruption. I mean, and I know, Dan, you agree because we've talked about DFC in the past. In some ways, choosing an organization of the caliber of DFC in the U.S. government, which has a history of successful sort of anti-corruption and transparency pushes for all of its projects all over the world. It's used to operating in environments where corruption is a risk, is a danger, and it's got a robust series of requirements, IFC performance standard type requirements related to all of its lending and all of its debt equity participation. It not different than maybe like a FinDev Canada or like other bilateral DFIs and multilateral DFIs. In some ways, these are, I don't think it's Pollyannish to say, these are some of the world's best hope for difficult extraction projects that tempt corruption and tempt sort of insider play. These organizations are the ones that are best situated, including DFC, for making a positive impact, positively implementing what will be a difficult task in any country, certainly one that is emerging from a war.
John, what a great back and forth. John, a question to you, because you're doing business in other parts of the world too. But so beside the obvious, a lasting peace in the Ukraine, what conditions or incentives would be needed and to make it a compelling investment destination for other companies from around the world?
Well, given what was established, that Europeans have as much an opportunity to get involved in this redevelopment of Ukraine's mining industry and as well as its processing industry, there's a lot of things that can be done on the legal and regulatory level. Certainly, modernizing the subsoil code to align with EU practices would be helpful. Creating a digital cadastry system, so you've got real-time access to geological data. Taking away, demystifying what the subsoil assets are is key to bringing in investor interest. Also, from an incentive standpoint, fixed royalty rates, tax stability clauses. These are part and parcel in the leading mining jurisdictions around the world. And certainly this may already be in place. International arbitration rights are key. That's the go-to method of contracts for most mining projects, at least in developing countries. When you look at infrastructure, and again, I think everyone recognizes that beyond securing peace, rebuilding infrastructure is going to be key, especially for the processing. And this is where I think Ukraine has a unique and comparative advantage. Is they don't just have the minerals, they have the ability to deliver really low cost electricity. They have the proximity to many of their clients in Western Europe. And so some of the things that are out there that can be used are infrastructure for offtake agreements. So money is committed for building infrastructure, and it's secured, if you like, by access to the critical minerals and critical metals that are being created. You've got green funds run by the EU and EBRD that include money to develop critical minerals and critical metal development. You've got all kinds of finance support, risk mitigation. When you're a miner and you are looking at 3 or 4 mines in different jurisdictions and you've got to decide which one you're going to focus on, it's not just the cost of capital, it's the premium, it's the country risk and the operational risk premium on top of that cost of capital that you use to discount your future revenues and come up with your risk-adjusted return on investment. And so there are ways to intervene and lessen that premium, that risk premium, by programs like MEG out of the World Bank. Certainly that would be probably in the toolbox of the FC. You've got blended finance structures. You can also build in accelerated depreciation so that mining investors who really are quite vulnerable in those first 2 or 3 years as they're building out a mine have the ability to depreciate that money very quickly, and they don't have to wait too long before they're cash flow positive once they're selling the ores. There's all kinds of strategic project co-financing put together by different development banks. One of the things that's going to be key, and I'd love to hear Dan's input on this, is labor. You've got a significant amount of the labor force at war today, sadly killed or injured. There will be plenty of men and women who will be psychologically damaged by the war and therefore may not be in a position to be very functional workers. You've got a certain amount of young Ukrainians, talented, often trilingual, talented Ukrainians who left the country. They probably left thinking temporarily, but now they're resettled in other places. They may or may not want to return. So there's going to be a labor shortage, which means that, and mining, the labor pool dedicated to mining engineering in Ukraine was probably pretty small. So if you're going to rapidly expand this industry, you've got to think about who's going to do that. So a lot of you're going to have to invest in training. And I can tell you that having worked with Ukrainian software engineers, they really understand the training pipeline that goes into creating a globally competitive workforce, but it takes time and it requires a lot of investment in that vocational training. But you're probably going to have to bring in engineers from other parts of the world to help boost that labor force. There's a lot that can be done, and we've already been talking about this, and certainly the U.S. deal is a part of this, but these strategic integration agreements, whether it's the Ukraine-EU Critical Raw Materials Partnership, creating offtakes with defense contractors who are part of the NATO and EU defense suppliers for things like titanium and rare earths. You may have some of the EV makers and battery makers also interested in offtake agreements. So this is a way of securing risk capital that really helps a project move forward. And the other thing, of course, is I know that some of the minerals that we're talking about that are really interesting are in areas that have been specifically under military contention, and therefore mines have been laid in the ground. And so what work has to be done to remove those mines or work around them with the right infrastructure to ensure that mining can be operated side by side with these dangerous territories is a bit of work that needs to be done. So those are some of the things that that Ukraine needs to be thinking about, but also its natural partners, be it the EU or the US or the mining companies, like you said, James, that would come out of Canada, Australia, South Africa, who would be interested in participating in this. These are some of the tools that they're going to want to work with to bring that risk down to a level that makes Ukraine a investment destination comparable to what is available to them today.
Wow, very thought-provoking things there that people haven't thought of. Dan, maybe just on that, can you talk a bit about the workforce and where people come from?
We had, at the beginning of the war, 8 million people left the country. Probably 4 have come back. And the bulk of those abroad are not all, but the majority would be women and their children. There is a significant portion of men that are abroad. So I think that the issue of labor force available labor force for big projects like these would have been there in any event because of exactly the things you talked about, John, that we had a very underdeveloped extraction sector. It had outdated infrastructure, which has now been compounded by war-related damage and, historical lack of investment. But, money helps solve a lot of that, both in terms of hiring smart people like you and others to advise on how to restructure or how to structure the industry. You have the likes of Schlumberger and others that understand that and can add value. We have the good news is our labor force is very, very smart. It has always been very, very adept at adapting. Ukrainian resilience has now become almost a historical meme around the globe. Most of the guys I know that are injured have been injured. Some quite badly. Some with multiple amputations. They go back. They go back to the front lines because they feel they owe it to their compatriots, to their comrades in arms. And they're fighting for, as they said, they're fighting for the future, my kids' future. And so that sort of, I think the whole country has PTSD. I don't even want to think about what I got, but I mean, it's, we will tough this through. And one of the biggest problems we are going to have is how do we actually find jobs for all of the people that come back from the war? And the veterans and the ones that have been injured. And it doesn't mean that they're useless in the workforce. In fact, many of them go back to heavy machinery or in fact, most of the soldiers now, there's a reason why the government is really putting an emphasis on taking in 18 to 24-year-olds, is because we need people who know how to use joysticks and our glasses and things like that. We don't need tank commanders anymore. My nephew joined the infantry last year, and he's now on the front line as a commander of a drone unit. And basically, the infantry provides support for the drone operators. They get them in and they get them out, because as soon as that drone goes, you're going to have almost a response within less than a minute. So, we're going to have lots of problems, but we're also going to have lots of opportunities. And the most fundamental issue for everybody, and this will affect business throughout the globe and certainly in Europe, is what do you do with the Russian army and with Russia? And unless they are, I come back to this, there is no half measure that will be worth anything. Any half measure means that we will be fighting this war again in 5-6 years. And it won't be just Ukraine. I mean, we could be looking at an incursion into Estonia or the Baltic states this fall. That's what military intelligence in Western Europe and in NATO are predicting, because Putin sees the West as weak. He sees the United States, unfortunately, as weak, and it really depends on the United States first and foremost to really say, okay, we are going to draw the line here. We are going to put crushing sanctions on you, and there is a bill in the Senate that says pretty much everything that I would want it to say, but it does not have the support of the White House yet. Right. And if that got through, that would be a huge step. Plus, we need continued intelligence in order that we are able to use all of our American supplied weapons in the accurate way that they're intended, and that we get anti-missile systems. This is absolutely critical. We have to protect our cities and protect our people. I think that a lot of the 4 million people that are left abroad, estimates are, if we have a proper peace and they have homes to come back to, and that's a big issue, and they have proper social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, clinics, 2/3 will come back. That's the estimate. So, and women, Ukraine is a matriarchate to begin with. If you've ever met a Ukrainian woman, you'll understand what I'm saying.
Wait, lots in Canada.
And women have really stepped into the roles that have in business and in the industry and in tech that have traditionally been with men, involved men. So I think on the labor side, we in this sector, we may import labor. I don't know. There'll be perhaps unemployment in lots of parts of Europe that they'll need a job. So I think that those issues are resolvable.
You touched on a lot of this. So, and I guess the peace process, it just continues on. I think you're saying that. Right.
Well, there's no peace process. I mean, let's call a spade a spade. There is no peace process. Right. There is a performative, theatrical staging for one person. But clearly Putin has demonstrated, and like, I'm a lawyer, I look at evidence, right? You can talk to me all you want, but it's all opinion unless I see evidence. I see no evidence whatsoever that Russia wants to stop this war. Whatever Putin is telling President Trump, he's telling President Trump, but the evidence is not there. The only way you get the Russians to stop the war is when Putin himself feels that his personal power is at stake. And that means that the costs of prosecuting the war are greater than the costs of not prosecuting the war. And we're not there yet.
Okay. We've got some questions that we've gotten earlier on from some of the participants. So maybe I'll just ask a couple of these right now. And this might be for Jamie, but consequences of a breach of the agreement, U.S. commitments to incentives to defend its investment. So thoughts on that? Or
Yeah, certainly the framework agreement doesn't lay that out. I would expect that which I have not seen, of course, the actual partnership agreement that was contemplated by the framework agreement, I think the consequences are going to be financial, meaning an exit for rights of the parties or damages of some variety. It'll be in the language of a partnership agreement, right? Of a fund partnership agreement is what I would expect. And so, I'm not sure. The question was if they're worried that the U.S. will breach or Ukraine will breach. But either way, I think there's a lot to be proven in this agreement, right? And there is the potential for a real fund with real participation in all of this investment. But it's still, I think it's fair to say it's a work in progress. Dan points out that they're starting to test it now, that they're eager to show that it will work. But particularly when it comes later to DFC's preferential rights, which we opened by talking about, to be able to negotiate on market price terms, all offtake of minerals from Ukraine for itself or its designee. There's a lot to unpack there with a lot of uncertainty as to exactly how that right would be worked. It's couched, as I said, as these will be requirements in licenses. Okay, so this will be a requirement on the private party in their license. Now, everybody knows a license to be you got to have the licensor enforce that portion of the license. I think it's fair to say that if offtake. Now, look, I'm a finance lawyer, right? Project finance lawyer. I always want to know where's the money coming from, right? Where does the money come into the project that allows the rest of the investment to come around it? If offtake is where it's all going to come down to whether this works or not as an actual inducement to mining in Ukraine, it's clear that DFC, not the partnership, but actually DFC will be in sort of the catbird seat for deciding whether it will take the minerals or it will assign its right to the minerals on a market basis, meaning it can't underbid the price. And the fact is, offtake for a lot of these minerals, right? We all know that it's the processing is occurring in China. It's not occurring in the United States. There are no smelters to send this to in the United States. So in some ways, offtake is, if that's the key to unlocking the real reconstruction that we're talking about here from a mineral perspective, there's a lot to work out as to how DFC will utilize this right to something like a right of first refusal, a right to participate in negotiations, a right not to be underbid. How it will exercise that right is going to be, how much you'll see people not following their license requirement, right? Because the mining companies are going to sell to someone, right? And if the United States isn't able through the DFC to provide an off-taker with the balance sheet, with the credibility to actually pay for the minerals on the offtake and to actually develop the minerals, then in some ways, I think to me, it's clear that this fund will not work, right? So it only works as a useful tool for mineral development if DFC exercises that very powerful right it will have in all these licenses judiciously and well, in a way that still invites all of those great mining companies we were talking about from South Africa, Canada, Australia, elsewhere, to actually make investments in Ukraine.
Yeah, and that, I guess we have another question that relates, I guess, just to the Canadian participation in this. What would be the implications for our mining sector or the opportunities? And
I think it's an historic opportunity, right, to participate in the exploitation of minerals in Ukraine. To do it successfully, I think you will need to have the ability to operate in a war-torn and difficult environment. You will need to be able to operate in a new and creative license regime that gives preferential rights to both this reconstruction fund in the financing of your endeavor, and ultimately you will need to navigate this offtake right successfully in a way that still allows the commercial principles that underpin a minerals investment to work, as well as serving the interests of the United States and the West and the Europeans in having supply chains that don't all run through Beijing.
Right. We have another question. Maybe anybody can answer this, but it's just an opportunity for startups. Does anybody see a role for startups in this? Obviously a complicated situation, but John, Dan or John?
I was being respectful of Jamie and muted myself. I mean, look, picking up on one of John's comments that we are the most mined country in the world right now, but we are also demining at a pace that nobody anticipated to a very large extent because of startups that have come out with ways to demine, and not just on the ground. Like we're talking about deep subsoil penetration with radar, autonomous flights, drones, both UGVs and unmanned ground vehicles, as well as UAVs. So that process has already started. Mostly Ukrainian startups, but a number of international, mostly charities, and international organizations have stepped up to help fund them, so that's one area. And I don't see why startups. I imagine that the big mining companies have their finger on all sorts of technologies that are emerging in the sector as it is.
Let me just comment quick. I mean, startups require both an entrepreneurial culture, but they also require certain institutional support. And I've traveled to 70 countries around the world. No country matches the entrepreneurial spirit of Ukraine. I saw it firsthand visiting and seeking out software companies to help our company build a digital platform. And I was just awestruck by the human capital of that country. And it's not just in Kyiv. It's spread around a dozen cities. And it's a testament to their education system, but also a testament to lack of capital and just the need and the slow movement of foreign investment in the country. So they just had to do it themselves. So there's no question they have the cultural what it takes to build an entrepreneurial society. I think that they have the legal structure, and I think it'll be even bolstered more with the U.S. and European interest in the country. The key is capital, right? So, where is that risk capital going to come from? And again, this is, I think development banks have gotten smart in the last 10, 15 years at funding risk capital. So, supporting the efforts of venture capital, of private equity and others as the vehicles of development. And I think that will be key. The ability, and I'd love to hear Jamie's thoughts on this, the ability of DFC and other DFIs to help fund risk capital players, private sector players, whether they're coming from the States, whether they're coming from other parts of Eastern Europe, whether they're coming from Germany, Britain, wherever. That I think is the really missing element.
Just piggyback on that, John. I agree that I mean, to me, that's one of the signals that you get from the fact that DFC and the Ukrainian P3 agency were the chosen limited partners in the reconstruction fund. You should expect that they picked DFC and that type, and this is again just like FinDev or IFC or all the multilateral and the bilateral development banks, all the European versions of that do the same thing. They have a long history and success story with investing in small businesses, entrepreneurial enterprises that support development. And I think it's hard to overstate, and I know Daniel can articulate this better than I and John, hard to articulate the economic opportunity that could come from the reconstruction in Ukraine for all citizens of Ukraine. And I would expect that the ancillary small businesses around the roads, bridges, transmission, substations, everything that needs to be rebuilt, all of the bit that needs to be rebuilt around the mining potential, the public-private partnerships, the roads, all of those to spin off major opportunities for entrepreneurs. And then I would expect capital to be able to flow from the EBRDs of the world, the IFCs of the world, the DFCs of the world, and if they do it correctly, this new partnership fund, right? This new reconstruction fund that is being set up and capitalized by half of the take of Ukraine in its minerals. The Ukrainian share, the government's share of its mineral production. So lots of opportunity, lots of work to do to make that a reality for entrepreneurs.
If I can just add from a Ukrainian perspective, I have both acted for OPIC previously and I've acted on the other side. And I have to say that when this agreement came out, the single greatest degree of comfort that I got out of this was seeing that the American side was going to be operated by DFC, because they have been always super professional. I have people there that I consider friends. They have America's interests first. They have Ukraine's interests in mind. They have a global perspective. When I was at UkraineInvest in 2016, I actually went to Washington to help lobby so that they wouldn't kill OPIC, which was on the block at the time, and they actually got, not because of my efforts, but they actually went from a 30 billion capitalization to a 60 billion capitalization, and that was in Trump 1.0. So I think that having DFC involved in this should give everybody comfort, and whether you're a major or a major mineral company or a minor miner, and I think that it gives the Ukrainians a degree of comfort too, because they've always been an honest a partner. They have not been treated well in the past, back in the 90s. In fact, Ukraine was a no-go zone for many years. But after being in the doghouse, after 2014, after the Maidan revolution, everything changed, and OPIC came back. I was involved in a major wind farm project in what's now occupied Zaporizhia, which they were funding, and the depth of expertise that they had was amazing. So I think that's something that's very reassuring. Just to give, because Jamie's been trying so hard from the American side, I thought I'd give him a little support on the Ukrainian side. I just want to touch one, if I may, James, just something that my friend John raised that I didn't address, and that is the issue of where are these minerals? Are they in occupied territory? Are they, how badly mined are they, et cetera? So I think it's important for everybody to know that, with the support of our allies, Ukraine has successfully defended about 80% of where its known mineral deposits are, with the obvious exception of coal and some parts of iron ore. About 75% of our lithium and graphite, 90% of our titanium, and 73% of the iron ore reserves are all in our hands, and we completely control aluminum, cobalt, copper, nickel, tin, and beryllium. And so, and these are not like right on the contact line. These are quite distant. A lot of the reserves are quite distant from the regions with active combat, military actions, and mostly in the northern and central part, and in central Ukraine. Lithium, for example, in Kirovohradska Oblast is on sort of straddles, but it's right on the Dnipro River, so it's right on the divide line. Obviously, there has to be some security, again, coming back to this, that that we expect, the clear expectation on the on Ukrainian side was that, and quite frankly, President Trump was saying this directly, I'm not going to give you a military security guarantee, but the fact that I signed this agreement means that we got your back because we have a vested interest in being in America. And we fervently hope that is going to be the case. I think, as I pointed out earlier, the Ukrainian government is now pushing that envelope with the lithium tender, and we'll see what happens.
Wow. Well, we got a couple of minutes left. Maybe we'll just get a final word from. Start with John, and then Jamie, and then we'll come back to conclude with Dan.
Well, as Daniel reminds us, this war is not over, and this conversation is hypothetical until it is. But one of the biggest incentives to bring more support from Europe and bring renewed support from the U.S. is the prize of critical minerals. And I think that discussions in Washington with Canada right now, the tense negotiations with China right now, and China holding this huge card against the Americans in their control of critical minerals, makes Ukraine's critical minerals industry that much more important. And I think a significant leverage for keeping that military support going and bringing this war to a conclusion, which means defeating the Russians and sending them back to Moscow. Once that's done, this is a viable industry, but it will require careful thought. It will require incentives. It will require work done on the ground in Ukraine, but also the right support, particularly from the EU, I would say, but also from the Americans, and a bit of courage from our mining industry to pursue these opportunities in a world where there are other places that can be mined.
Thank you. Jamie?
Just to say, courage for the mining, for our mining clients, but also I think there is a real possibility that this relationship could work between the United States and Ukraine in this space. There's a lot of work to do to make it real and to make it productive and to unlock investment. But if I were a mining company with capabilities to explore and operate in Ukraine, I would want to begin the process of acquainting myself with both this new fund on both the Ukrainian and the DFC and the U.S. limited partner side, as well as using the opportunity that is here now, which is it isn't fixed yet, it isn't complete yet, to shape how this reconstruction fund could operate and what its priorities could be. I think there's just a huge opportunity for the right companies with the capability to participate in Ukraine to shape this partnership in a way that could benefit the United States, Ukraine, and the free world.
Thank you. Dan, you got the final word.
Well, I mean, I think I've probably said everything I have to say, except that picking up on what my colleagues and friends have said is that, it's not just the United States that has a stake now in the future of Ukraine. I think that Europe clearly does. And so does Canada and Australia. I think every country that is a democracy needs to understand that this is their fight too, and that there is a prize, as John points out, at the end. And aside from, as Jamie says, acquainting yourself with how that prize might work, you can help bring that prize around pretty quickly, or much quicker, by lobbying your countries and your governments to do what they have to do to protect us, arm us, and defeat the Russians in Ukraine. And that's just not weapons; it can be sanctions as well. Germany did not lose World War I on the battlefield. Germany literally ran out of gas. when its productive capacity was obliterated. And Russia, you don't get this in the Western media. It's too bad most of you don't read Russian, listen to Russian Telegram or read Russian Telegram channels. Russia's not doing great. Russia, it's like a bankruptcy. You can roll it over. I was a bankruptcy lawyer at Fasken. You can roll it over, and then one day it just all collapses. And that is not a bad thing. So I'll just leave that with you.
Good. Well, thank you, Dan. Dan's been communicating with the firm since the beginning of the war, and it's just been a fascinating.
Well, the firm's been communicating with me, which I really do want. I'm glad you mentioned it, James, because I really do want to express my own personal gratitude to Karen and Martin and Catherine Pollock, who I articled with, and everybody at Faskens who have been really supportive of myself and of Ukraine, and especially as well to John, who and Michael Barassa, who constantly, it's very hard to really articulate how much that really means, and I'm grateful to the people of Canada as well, and God bless you all. Thank you.
Well, you certainly educated a lot of people today, as did the rest of the panel. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. On your screens right now, in the audience chat, you'll see the QR codes and links to the CBD certificate, CPD certificate and our survey, which we hope you'll fill out to give us some feedback on this event. Thanks for a great afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.